We're here to talk about one of the great running sores of our age and one of the continuing, arguably, great injustices in the world. We were hoping to have Lord Treesman, the Minister for Africa from the British government, here tonight. Unfortunately, he pulled out at the last minute. I think something might be happening in Iran, which is preoccupying all the Foreign Office ministers. And so he sends his apologies for not being able to make the commitment. Let me introduce you to our panel. Gugulethu Moyo from the International Bar Association beside me. Wilf Mbanga from the Zimbabwean, a newspaper, as you will all know, that's run from Britain because it's impossible to do so in Zimbabwe. And Daniel Howden of the Independent here in the UK, who's just come back from Zimbabwe and was there, in fact, 6 months ago as well, I think. Yeah. What I intend to do is just... And on the phone, actually, Bill Saidi, also of the Zimbabwean, who's joining us via a phone link, I hope, if it all works, from Harare. So what I intend to do is kick off by asking a few questions myself, and then, as soon as possible, open it out to all of you, because I suspect this is a highly expert audience, and I suspect you all know far more about the situation and are far more clued up than I am. So let me start by asking you, Bill Saidi in Zimbabwe. Today's national strike, is he there?
He's not there yet. We're dialing him now.
You're dialing him now. Okay. Then I will start with Wilf. Wilf, what news do you have from Zimbabwe today? Has the strike attempt been successful?
Right. Well, what has happened today is that in places like Bulawayo and Harare, the industrial sites resembled a Sunday. There was virtually no activity. But in the center of town, unfortunately, some unions urged their workers to go to work. And, of course, civil servants all went to work. So in the center of Harare today, it was normal. The police went round people's homes in Glenview and Mbare, beating up people and forcing them to go to work. And they also told a number of shopkeepers to open their shops, or they'll have them, they'll take away their licenses.
We might have Bill.
Gugulethu, let me ask you, we've had so many of these moments over the last 7 or 8 years where there's a promise of mass action and it doesn't succeed. Why do you think, structurally, the opposition, the democratic opposition, has failed to devise a strategy capable of really challenging the power of the government?
Well, first of all, I think this particular action this particular action was organized by the Congress of Trade Unions, although it had support from the Movement for Democratic Change. Why haven't they been able to sustain? In the 90s, the strikes, the stay were very effective. People stayed away from home. But I think a lot of things have changed. One of the things, of course, that happened was that when people did stay away from home, the police would go into their homes and beat them up. So that deterred a lot of people. The other thing is that employers do not want to be targeted by government. So they also say to their workers, if you don't turn up for work, we'll fire you. So there is always that threat. And in a situation where 80% of people are unemployed, or something like 4 out of 5 people are unemployed, I think that is a real threat, and that's something that people consider when they embark on these kind of actions. If you're found at home, you'll be beaten up. If you don't turn up at work, anywhere your employer will sack you. So I'm not sure that they think that it will achieve much. And in any case, also, they realize that their government isn't responsive. This is a government that didn't respond when doctors and nurses were on strike. If they won't respond to that kind of situation, I'm not sure that people who are working in sectors that are not sort of essential services could get much out of a strike action.
I want to bring in Daniel in a second, but Wilf, given what Gugulethu has just said, what options does that leave the democratic opposition? What can they do? It seems that every avenue they pursue, a door is slammed in their face.
Well, yes, because Mugabe is determined to have a semblance of normalcy in the country, he will make sure that any strike in Zimbabwe does not succeed. So he will go to any length to make sure that people actually do turn out for work. So that makes it very difficult for the opposition to organize anything of the sort. So the only thing, in the past they used to march in the streets of Harare and the police would go out and bash their heads. Then they told them to stay away so that they could be in their own homes and not provoke the police. And now the police actually follow them to their homes and beat them up in their homes. So, that leaves very little room for maneuver, for the opposition.
Daniel, you've just come back from there. What are your principal impressions?
Well, the tactic that we've been talking about, which is finding people, isolating them, and delivering punishment beatings, is now basically a nightly ritual. In the townships outside of Harare, fortunately as yet not so much so outside of Bulawayo, hit squads who have been issued with cars from the state, police issue weapons, in plain clothes, going into people's houses, dragging them out at gunpoint, isolated from groups, always isolated from groups, and they're delivering beatings which leave them in hospital with serious injuries. And women have miscarried after beatings, people are left with broken ribs, people who have jobs can't possibly think about working for the next 6 months. And while this doesn't generate the 150 dead in Congo in a single day's fighting, while it's not Mogadishu where 400 people have been killed in the last 2 days, it is a mass intimidation tactic that's proven very effective. If you're in opposition to Robert Mugabe's government and you're in Harare and you want to go on strike, you feel very alone. And that's a big problem.
Gugu.
Another thing I think that I overlooked is just the information that people would have about the strike. The people in this room probably know a great deal more about the strike action today than people in Zimbabwe would know. Media is state-controlled in Zimbabwe. The daily newspapers are government-controlled. They don't carry advertisements from the opposition, and that includes, of course, the official trade union. There is another government-controlled trade union which they would carry advertisements from them. So people would not know that, what plans the ZCTU had for today's strike. Instead, what they would have read on Sunday was a lead story in the Sunday Mail, which said that the Australian government was paying people to go on strike in order to discredit Zimbabwe, so there was some Western intervention and some Western organization of a strike. And obviously, people don't want to be associated with that kind of thing because the government then threatens to take action on anybody who's involved in that. And also today there was another story attacking the British, the spokesperson for the British High Commission in Zimbabwe. So this is the kind of thing that people would receive, and throughout the course of the day, there would be broadcasts suggesting that the strike had been a failure, everybody had turned up at work, and so on. Very confusing if you have to decide what to do.
Wilf, tell me about the personal qualities of Morgan Tsvangirai, because obviously after 8 years promising liberation, Morgan himself ends up with a lot of egg on his face, subject to criticism not just from around the world but from within his own movement, that he's weak, that he's ineffectual. Are those criticisms fair, or given the insurmountability of the obstacles he faces, has he performed creditably, do you think?
Well, it's very difficult for anybody to operate effectively in Zimbabwe, given the state resources against one. In Zimbabwe today, the media, the major newspapers, the Herald, the Chronicle, which are the national dailies, are controlled by the government. Radio and television controlled by government. So every day they are told that Morgan Tsvangirai is a failure, Morgan Tsvangirai is an imperialist puppet, and so on. And that's why a lot of people actually do believe this.
How do you rate him?
He's brave. Somebody who has managed to survive in Zimbabwe, given what has happened to him, is, for me, I salute him. He has been on trial for treason on a trumped-up charge, and that took 2 years. I was on trial. When I was arrested, from the day we were arrested to the day of final judgment, that took 4 months. I felt uncomfortable during that period. I didn't have my passport. I had to report to the police once a week and so on. And you feel a load over your head. Morgan had that, had the death sentence hanging over his head for 2 years. That has an effect on one.
Daniel, what do you think his standing in the country is?
Certainly very different than his standing outside of the country. I mean, the perception was that Morgan was going nowhere, and that the opposition was split, and that there was very little credibility. The beating that he took in a police station in Highfield in Harare has certainly rescued his international standing. It remains to be seen whether it's rescued his standing inside the country. I mean, we made the point before that we, the majority of us sitting in this room, are aware that there's a 2-day stay away beginning today in Zimbabwe. A large number of Zimbabweans don't know exactly what the preparations are for this, what their role within this is going to be. Organisation in a country where the media is under state control is obviously very difficult. If that's the case, certainly then pictures of Morgan with his skull cracked open and 2 dark black rings around his eyes that had such an impact on international opinion, for the most part, haven't been seen in Zimbabwe. I mean, the news runs every night, but it doesn't show police officers suspected of fracturing the skull of main opposition leader.
Let me ask Gugu about the people who are doing that fracturing, because there comes a point in the lifetimes of many dictatorships, and I saw it myself in Serbia in the end, and I know that the MDC leaders were very interested in this, because I was in Zimbabwe shortly after being in Serbia when Milosevic fell, and they were very interested in a dynamic of the collapse of the Milosevic regime. There came a point when the people who were sent into the streets to break heads simply refused to keep on doing it in Serbia. And Milosevic lost the power to command the army and the police to carry on committing atrocities. What is it that makes that power, Mugabe's power, what is it that sustains the loyalty of the people who are capable of imposing this regime of fear?
I don't know what sustains the loyalty. What I do know is that the military is heavily involved in Zimbabwean politics, and that's something that is often overlooked in reports about Zimbabwe. The security forces make a range of decisions, and of course, the beatings of Morgan Tsvangirai and so on were triggered by a decision that was taken by people in the security forces. They decided that the security situation was such that they ought to ban political rallies. And, then there was a response from the opposition, and a range of mechanisms were put in place to ensure that people did not demonstrate and that the situation did not get out of control. And there have been a range of statements from the security services, the heads of the security services, about the situation and the role of the military. One of the things that is clear is that the police, the members of the army, are being affected by the situation. Some 5,000 or so, or 3,000 perhaps, or something like that, police officers have left the service of the ZANU-PF recently. You have also large numbers deserting the military forces. And I think a few months ago also, Chihuri or Chiwenga was said to have warned the governor of the Reserve Bank that, we don't want to have to turn our guns on hungry Zimbabweans. You need to take care of the economic situation. So it's quite clear that it's affecting people within the military. But then there is an elite, I think, that does buy into the whole arrangement. They want to survive, and they're in control of the security forces, and they have, I think, enough resources to buy loyalty in many cases. There's also, I think, indoctrination that has taken place over a long period. Particularly from 2000, there was a sort of program to indoctrinate people in the police force. So they do regard people who work for the opposition, who are journalists and are seen as dissenters, as opposition, as enemies of the state. And this is their approach. And so for many people, you can't understand why they do it, but they believe that they're doing the right thing. When they beat up, people. My own experience was something like that. I turned up at a police station, was beaten up, and the things that the police officers said to me when they were beating me up were very simple things. They said, the first thing was, can you speak in Shona? And I said, not very well. Oh, you're in Ndebele, you can't speak Shona, we'll beat you until you speak Shona. So you work for the Daily News, you work for the British, and it went on like that. So they must have had a sense that, this was the thing to do to somebody who was different in a way. So I think that's part of the explanation.
Daniel and then Wilf.
One thing I would like to say is that it does actually come down, I think, as you suggested, to the personal. And there is very definitely a movement at the moment which means that when it comes to the specifics of these so-called hit squads, the guys that are actually going around in a silver twin-cab Isuzu and picking up people from specific neighbourhoods like Glenview and administering punishment beatings, we know who they are. People know who they are. This is a very small number of people that are doing this. Their names are common currency in Harare. People know the boarding house that they're staying in.
Does that partially answer my question?
It does.
Is it that there is a fear of retribution, and so people are clinging on to the old regime for fear of retribution?
But that suggests
should the regime fall?
That suggests that you could deploy any police officer, you could put him in any room, and he would beat whoever was put in front of him, which is just simply not the case.
Wilf.
Well, one of my reporters is behind bars right now, Gift Piri. He was very badly beaten by the cops. And when they were beating him up, they accused him of compiling a list which we carry in the newspaper. As of 3 weeks ago, we now run on page 2 a list of all the policemen, their names, their addresses, where it's known, who have been beating up people. And they are worried about that. They wanted to know where he's getting these names from. And he told them he had nothing to do with it. This list is compiled by MDC. But they were worried about that. But anyway, just to go back to your earlier question about loyalty, Mugabe has been very careful over the years to take care of the senior policemen, senior army officers and Air Force officers. In the past, he's given them new cars every 2 years. Anybody above the rank of brigadier gets a Mercedes-Benz, the very latest, every 2 years. They buy the old one at book value, which is 25% off for each year. In Zimbabwe, cars appreciate in value, they don't depreciate. They are well taken care of. They had the diamonds from the Congo. Now we have our own diamonds. So the top brass in the army, the police, have been taken care of until now. And those at the bottom is where you have restlessness. That's where there are rumblings of discontent. They're the ones who are now deserting. They're now going to South Africa and so on. But the people at the top are now beginning to suffer because some of them have gone into business. And now what's happening in the country is now affecting their businesses, their ability to make money. They suddenly find that their salaries now can't keep up with inflation. So they are now beginning to waver. But Mugabe makes sure that he keeps you on a short leash. Even those who are not loyal, he makes sure that they are. Because over the years, these people have been given farms, some of them have committed offenses, they've been let off. He knows who has done what. They keep files on everyone in Zimbabwe. They can just suddenly spring charges against them. So they all know this. Mnangagwa has been committing offenses, over the years. And he has not bothered to resign. He can't resign because Mugabe will have him in court tomorrow.
Well, since you mentioned him, let's talk about what's happening in the... there's two other things I want to talk about before I throw it open. What's happening inside ZANU-PF at the moment, how they're planning for the inevitable transition, because he's 83 now, and he is not immortal. And then what neighbouring countries are up to. What is going on, Wilf, in the leadership of ZANU-PF? How are they preparing?
Well, they're now beginning to think of a post-Zimbabwe, a post-Mugabe Zimbabwe, and already there are 2 or 3 factions. There is the Joyce Mujuru faction, headed by her husband, then the Emerson Mnangagwa faction, and there is another faction which supports Mugabe, which will die with Mugabe, will go down with Mugabe. And at the moment, they've got the upper hand. The Mujurus are interested in taking over from Mugabe because they feel Mugabe has become a liability. Solomon Mujuru is one of the wealthiest people in Zimbabwe, and his businesses are now suffering because of what's going on. And so it's in his interest to get rid of Mugabe, but for his own reasons, not because he's suddenly become converted, is now aware we need democracy, we need to respect human rights. No. In fact, we'll have more of the same under his reign, or his wife's reign. Then there's Emmerson Mnangagwa, who has always believed he was the heir apparent from right back from 1980. And then he took a wrong turn a couple of years ago when some people in ZANU-PF believed in democracy. And they organized a meeting in Cholocho before Congress. And he had 6 of the 10 provincial chairmen rooting for him. Mugabe got wind of that meeting and he sacked all those 6 chairmen. So in fact, Emmerson would have been vice president of ZANU. And Mugabe then started to demote him. But lately, he's now realized that in fact, he's with nobody else who could take over. He no longer wants the Mujurus. The Mujurus are kind of pushing him. So he wants Emmerson now, but only because it will cause more confusion within ZANU-PF. That's how Mugabe operates. He is a past master at the rule and divide and rule.
Let me ask you, do either of these two factions, Mnangagwa or Mujuru, represent the hope of progressive change from within ZANU-PF? Is there any constituency of opinion within ZANU-PF that represents the possibility of progressive change?
I don't think so. But I think that there are many people who would differ with me. I do think that the moves to get rid of Mugabe are really preemptive. They want continuity, and they also realize, I think that, and I think we'll talk about this later on, but South Africa's ambitions for Zimbabwe are very limited. So the people in ZANU-PF are really trying to preserve themselves. They're preserving their financial interests. They also want to protect themselves from being held accountable. And I think that's an important factor. If they go down with Mugabe, they are more likely to then be vulnerable to prosecution and so on. These are people who are very corrupt. Mugabe, during his birthday speech, said, all the people around me are corrupt. And I think, coming from Mugabe, that's something. So, I don't think that they're Democrats. And again, things have been run in Zimbabwe in a military fashion. So, this is the style of leadership that, they have. And also within ZANU-PF, it's not a democratic party, and you can see that from what has happened recently. They can't get rid of Mugabe within ZANU-PF. So I just don't think that they are Democrats.
Let me ask Daniel this, because when I was still allowed to go to Zimbabwe before all the BBC correspondents got banned from going there, I remember going to see a member, quite a well-known member of the Central Committee of ZANU-PF, and he'd just come from a meeting, and he said to me, before the old man comes in, we all sit around there, and the only thing we're talking about is how to get rid of him. This is 7 years ago, or 6 years ago. We're all sitting around talking. The only thing we're interested in is how we're going to persuade him to stand down. And then he walks into the room with his entourage, and we all leap up and start singing praises and clapping, and he seemed to have a mesmeric effect on people around, even people who knew that the sooner he went, the better. But what was interesting about that exchange is that I, as a foreign reporter, and a British reporter, in fact, was still able to get that kind of access to people in the leadership of ZANU-PF. Are you still able to do that as a British reporter in Zimbabwe?
Not quite. Not and come back to the front line and talk about it. That's the slight problem. However, what the situation you just described remains perfectly true. He waltzed into the Central Committee meeting while the whole world was waiting for the palace coup, myself in brackets as naive reporter slightly in the same category. he came in, there was a song and a dance, there was an entourage, they were dancing, they were wearing multicolored T-shirts, I am told, because I can't go there, and he swept them all aside. I mean, he is a showman, he is a wily politician, he isn't, as Wilf said, a past master of divide and rule. I mean, the impressive thing is he doesn't just divide and rule his own party, he divides and rules the opposition. The opposition is split in two factions. They are presenting a public face while, having spoken to both leaders in the last week, privately arguing intensely with each other and delivering quite enjoyably smart, withering asides about each other in the process. Mugabe is a piece of work.
Let me ask Gugulethu, because you mentioned South Africa. How is it that, especially given the progressive changes that have happened in Southern Africa over the last 15 years or so, the transition to democracy in South Africa, the progress that's been made in Mozambique, lots of examples, that he's able to come back from a meeting of SADC and say, they see the entire region, they all support me. What is going on with Zimbabwe's neighbours?
I'm not sure what is going on with Zimbabwe's neighbours. I read an interview, the transcript of an interview that Thabo Mbeki gave to the Financial Times. The first thing that I thought was that, what a pity he doesn't make these very revealing statements to newspapers that are in South Africa, and particularly newspapers that go into Zimbabwe. It's not the first time that I've read, things from Thabo Mbeki in the Financial Times that I haven't read anywhere else.
For example,
that's just
what do you mean?
An aside. He does tend to give these exclusives to the Financial Times, which is great, but people don't read them in the region, so they don't know what his thinking is. So he said this, for instance, that we weren't happy with Mugabe. We told him we didn't like the violence. We'd seen the pictures, but that's not there's nothing like that out there in the South African media. In fact, Mugabe was able to go back and say, they told me, I told them that Morgan Tsvangirai deserved a beating, and they said nothing to me. So Thabo Mbeki hasn't responded to that, where the response needs to be made, because people still then believe, well, actually these guys think it's okay. And that's very important for the people on the ground to know that SADC is not happy with that kind of situation. It is very disappointing that South Africa doesn't say more about the rights situation. So even in his interview, he talked about the politics and the economics, and he said that those are the big concerns that we have, and we need to sort that out, and we need to have dialogue between the MDC and ZANU-PF. He didn't say anything about the rights situation, and I think that is a slightly different thing from talking about the MDC and ZANU-PF. People are being abducted, people are being beaten up as we speak, lawyers are being denied access to their clients, people are being harassed in all sorts of ways and intimidated, and SADC is not saying anything about that. And, he said something like, we don't like it. I think it's more than that. They have an obligation to promote human rights. They are signed up to international instruments which they signed up to voluntarily, and they must be seen to promote human rights. But they don't. The Human Rights Council recently discussed the situation in Zimbabwe, and Ghana was, the representative from Ghana said, we are really concerned about the situation in Zimbabwe. And guess what? South Africa said, no, this is not an international issue. In the Human Rights Council recently, this is after, the beatings and so on. And, it's difficult to understand why South Africa would take that kind of position. The position that they've taken in the Security Council is slightly more understandable, but it's not really understandable. The argument there is that it's not a security, the situation in Zimbabwe is not a threat to international peace and security, so it's not something that should be before the Security Council. But for them to then obstruct a debate in the Human Rights Council is really baffling.
But isn't this a bit worrying about South Africa, Wilf? Because isn't part of the answer to this question that what Mugabe has done in Zimbabwe is, in large parts of South African public opinion, actually very popular?
Well, the problem is that, the black South Africans are still fighting against apartheid, or the residual effects of apartheid. And they see their own government not failing to deliver on the promises of majority rule. They see wealth still in white hands. They see the majority of farms in white hands. And then they see, on the other hand, Mugabe, who says he's delivering for blacks. He's taking land from the whites and giving it to blacks. And that finds resonance among the...
Yes, but at the same time, in every township in South Africa, Zimbabweans who pitch up there, desperate, are being rounded upon by black South Africans because they're coming in and taking jobs and begging and so on. And so in their daily lives, black South Africans know very well how desperate the situation is in Zimbabwe.
I don't think they do. I think, they see people coming over the border,
and they don't like them.
They don't like Zimbabweans who are coming to take their jobs. They're better educated. They're taking their women and so on. It's an issue. There is now this xenophobia in South Africa against Zimbabweans. And there's nothing Zimbabweans can do about that. But unfortunately, people in Soweto still applaud when Mugabe goes to Soweto. They think he's a hero. And this is also a problem throughout Africa, that Mugabe is seen as a hero. And he projects himself as the leader of the anti-imperialist movement.
And so Mbeki is right to be afraid of that, isn't he?
Well, Mbeki can't afford to be seen to be criticizing this African leader who is very popular in Africa, who is attacking the imperialists. He doesn't want to be seen to be in the pocket of the West. He can't afford that politically.
Right, I've hogged this discussion for long enough. Well, we've got about 45 minutes yet. There's a hand up. I can't see who it is. Yes.
Hold on, wait for
Audrey, can you wait until the microphone gets to you?
My name is Audrey. I'm South African. And I work for the BBC World Service. That's why I'm here. I think that the picture that you sketched about South Africa and the population's response to what's happening in Zimbabwe is a whole lot more complex than what you're saying. Because, for instance, today the trade union movement in South Africa actually supports the people of Zimbabwe. And they have very often criticized the government of South Africa for the position that it takes vis-a-vis the government of Zimbabwe, the actions of the government of Zimbabwe. The entire human rights community in South Africa is opposed to what is happening in Zimbabwe. So when we talk about anecdotally what, taking their girlfriend, taking their women, taking their jobs, etc., I think we really have to be more responsible about what we say about how people are reacting to it.
But Audrey, why do you think then Thabo Mbeki has failed to stand up for the sorts of forces that brought him to power? Progressive forces, progressive change, democratic change and so on. Why has he so signally failed over 8 years to defend those values in the Zimbabwean context?
Look, I mean, the complexities of Thabo Mbeki's mind escape me as well, actually. And I can say infinitely worse things about him than anybody on the stage can say, just in terms of criticizing him for all the range of things that he's done in South Africa, about, concerning our own problems as well. Not that Zimbabwe is not a sort of regional story or regional concern, but I do feel that Zimbabwe is almost treated like a 10th province of South Africa. It is as if it's entirely South Africa's responsibility to do something about it. But that kind of aside, and I really didn't want to respond specifically to the South African situation. I just wanted us to be aware of the fact that it's a lot more complex than just the anecdotes that we hear about things. And the issue of xenophobia, for instance, is international. It's not a specifically South African disease either.
Sure.
And it's not, and it doesn't refer only to Zimbabwean reaction, to Zimbabwean influxes either.
Yeah, and I don't want to turn this into a discussion about South Africa, but it is impressive about South Africa. You have these very strong and rooted institutions of civil society, which are far braver and far more outspoken and far more potent in their defense of human rights and democracy than the ANC has ever been, or the government. But anyway,
I mean, it is. I think you put your finger on it. It is the government that you're talking about. You now have a government in South Africa that is taking the position that it does. And I might also just say that I think the issue of collective leadership and collective responsibility is quite a focal point of South Africa's international and regional diplomacy. So I see it in that context, in the context of the AU and in the context of SADC as well.
Okay.
And I mean, there are other forces that act there. But what I really wanted to ask was what I found astonishing, like all the things that you detailed about what's happening in Zimbabwe, to me is very much what happened in apartheid South Africa, the beatings, the intimidation, the lack of information, and that tipping point that you talk about, Alan, also happened in South Africa, in fact, in 1989, when the police refused to go out and assault South Africans anymore. Black policemen said they're not doing this anymore. And the trauma that was suffered by a lot of white police for shooting black children. I mean, the tipping point came at the end of a very long process of struggle. So I'm just wondering whether Zimbabwe, in a sense, doesn't have to go through that, where you have to build viable institutions, etc. But I also want to know about the nature of the state. You've hinted a little bit about it. But where does this regime actually come from? It seems like the last 7 years it's suddenly become monstrous. Is that the case?
Okay, let's get a response from Daniel.
Well, the short answer to it, it's not a creation of the last 7 years. And for veteran Mugabe watchers, and I wouldn't necessarily include myself in that category, if we were to go back to 1980, the origins of this are clearly there to see right back in 1980 with the language and rhetoric. And Mugabe himself said that he's a Democrat, but he's a Democrat of the gun. As far as he's concerned, the gun and the ballot box go directly together. That's how they came together in the first place. That's how the ballot box has won, and that's how the ballot box will be controlled. Mugabe set about entrenching his power immediately and creating essentially a one-party state. The worst of the brutality, which were it going on today, the Guguruhundi, which claimed anything between 25 and 40,000 lives, depending on who you want to believe. If were that going on today, then people's point of view on Mugabe would be significantly worse than it is now.
Gugu, would you like to respond to the point from the floor from Audrey?
Where did the regime come from? Yeah, I think, Guguruhundi is an important issue that is often ignored in the reporting on Zimbabwe. And I think it's unfortunate because I think if people understood that many things that are much worse than what is going on right now happened in Matabeleland and other parts of the south of Zimbabwe in the 80s, I think they would understand, the violence that is taking place now. And so when we talk about abductions taking place now and people dying, I must mention that the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings today issued a statement on Zimbabwe's condemning the two killings by the police of opposition supporters, and also mentioned 8 other suspicious deaths, which I wasn't aware of, which they believe are related to state-sponsored violence. So, when we say that these things are happening, it's not an exaggeration because things could get a lot worse. And for me, I grew up in Matabeleland, I understand that. But you will find, and I think Wilf can comment on this because I read a very interesting piece by him. He was a journalist in the 80s, and he said, he didn't report this because, like many people, he had a sort of a bit of a love affair with Mugabe, and when he asked Mugabe, I think he said he did ask him what was going on in Matabeleland. He was told, this was a response to some uprising or something, and also something to do with apartheid. South Africa interfering with Zimbabwe, trying to destabilize the government. So they didn't report it that way. And as a journalist, I think he can comment on those kind of issues.
We need to get a comment from Wilf on that. I'll get a question from the back in a second. But Wilf, is that right? Is Gugu's characterization of your position in the 80s accurate?
Well, it's true. In the early 80s, like most journalists in Zimbabwe, I had known Mugabe for much longer than most people. I was actually very close to him than most people in Zimbabwe. He was a personal friend. He used to even visit me at home, at my own home, and we used to listen to music, have sadza, and so on. And I used to travel with him in the early 80s when I was editor of the national news agency, ZANU. I traveled all over the world with him as part of his delegation. And when the problems in Matabeleland started, one of my reporters, Lazarus Mpofu, who was based in Bulawayo, picked up the story. And I phoned Justin Yoka, who was the director of information, and I said, well, I heard this story, what's happening in Matabeleland? And the next minute, Emerson Mnangagwa phoned me and told me to meet him at State House, because he had given the president this story and he wanted to brief me. So I went to State House and had a 2-hour briefing by Mugabe. And as Alan said earlier, he does mesmerize one. I sat there in his lounge being briefed. I was the only journalist in his house. He's taking all this time to brief me about what was going on in Matabeleland. And he convinced me that, all that was happening in Matabeleland was South Africa was trying to destabilize this new state of Zimbabwe. They were funding and equipping the dissidents in Matabeleland, and it was nothing but a foreign intervention using Zimbabwean puppets, and so on. At the end of the day, I thought, well, he's got a point, and there's no story here. Much to my regret, I hang my head in shame because of what happened. Like all other editors in Zimbabwe, we all didn't think it was a story at the time.
All other editors in Zimbabwe, or all other editors in Mashonaland?
No, even editors in Matabeleland.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
The story in Zimbabwe did not see the light of day until much later. Until 83, 84. That's when it really...
Let's get a question from the back there, yeah.
My name is Eldridge Caldwell. I'd like to just ask Daniel. He spoke about Mugabe being sort of revered by the Southern African states. Do you think to add to Mugabe's popularity was the opposition's non-activity, as hence Pius Newberg severely criticized Morgan, as well as when Morgan, soon after he was beaten, called for Western intervention? Do you think that was a good issue, or do you think that was one of the factors that's given the SADC states this golden glow of Mugabe?
Well, I'm actually quite keen to talk about the SADC states. I'm sometimes struck by the credulity on this side, looking from London towards the south. We should sometimes take a step back and think about who the SADC states are and what it is that they do. And in many cases, I think you'd be struggling to differentiate between that and common policies of Mugabe. Suppression of the opposition, arbitrary arrest, corrupt judiciary, violation of the rule of law, etc., 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 are certainly not outside of the kind of standard remit of several of the SADC members. So sometimes when we talk about SADC members and we we wring our hands in London about why are they not acting against Mugabe, well, the answer to that possibly is that the expectations of what SADC members are going to be thinking and doing can sometimes be rather naive.
But the man's point is that when people inside Zimbabwe start arguing for Western intervention, it sounds like a call for the revival of colonialism. It plays straight into Mugabe's hands, doesn't it?
It does, but that debate is going to be, or rather, that means of framing the debate is going to be impossible to put to one side. Morgan wasn't really left with much of a choice. He was being contacted by English papers who were pursuing news lines and were saying to him, "Are you unhappy with the support that you're receiving from the British government?" To which he was responding, "I do not want to criticise or even talk about intervention from the British government." The opposition
he tells the British government to keep quiet. His advice to the British government is not to take a position on this. Let me ask Gugu this question. Daniel's saying that the reason the SADC countries don't criticise Mugabe is that they're all just like him. Do you think that's true?
Not quite. I think that to be fair, the situation is quite different. Depending on which SADC country you are looking at. There are certain things. For instance, if you go to Namibia, where I lived for some time, you won't find independent newspapers that carry the kind of strong editorial lines against the government that you find in the Zimbabwean Independent and so on. So, there is a difference. In Zambia, also, the state has taken action against journalists that is quite similar to some of the things that have happened to journalists in Zimbabwe, except for perhaps the violence. But I think that there's more than that. Remember, these countries, many of them were also colonies of the United Kingdom. before then, or colonies of Western powers. And they do feel that they shouldn't be dictated to, and that the West doesn't have a moral kind of authority on these kind of issues. So there is that element. They do want to take ownership of the issue. But one of the things that has happened in the past is that the West has intervened simply because what they have done and what they said they've been doing hasn't been effective.
Let's get a question from, man here.
So, hi, my name is Chris Morgan. I'd just like to make one point and then ask a question of the panel. The one, I think South Africa's response needs to be looked at of the domestic position. Mbeki's coming up for a very big year, and I think the sort of very right-wing economic policies that South Africa's followed quite consciously for the last 14 years, this now divide in the ANC and the very strong left-wing support, I think Mbeki can ill afford to alienate that group by siding. I think we have a very big rural population in South Africa that does support Mugabe, for the right reasons. We've had a woefully slow, badly performed land reform program that has sort of been faltering, and I think the sooner South Africa can address that issue, we can address other issues more readily. But I'd like to ask the panel more directly. Basically, what it seems to me we're talking about is there's this Mugabe represents this regime that needs to be changed. With the current global problems we've seen with other regime changes, what do the panel actually think the course of action for SADC and the West should be?
Wilf. Because if there is regime change, there's going to have to be a major international effort and a major domestic effort inside the country, isn't there?
Right. Well, when we talk of a regime change, we're not talking of just getting rid of Mugabe alone. We're talking of getting rid of ZANU-PF, which is a major change. And we've got to talk of bringing in some elements from ZANU that can be reformed and bring them into initially some kind of government of national unity, where the new constitution is then going to be rewritten. We need to bring about a leveling of the playing field. We need a kind of Marshall Plan for Zimbabwe, because the economy has been badly damaged. The infrastructure is badly damaged. We need to rebuild the country. We need to get to all the Zimbabweans who are outside the country. 1 in 4 of the Zimbabweans now lives outside the country. We need to get all those people back. That's our brain power. We need to virtually start from scratch. So it's going to take a long time, to get this country going, on its feet again.
Gugu, is there a danger? We were talking earlier before we came up here. Is there a danger that in the course of the transition, which will one day inevitably come, Zimbabweans will feel that they've lost ownership of their own transition?
Yes, I think so. I think Zimbabweans feel that way even now, or at least many Zimbabweans feel that way even now. The dialogue that Thabo Mbeki and the SADC group have spoken of is described as dialogue between ZANU-PF and the MDC. Now, those parties do not represent all Zimbabweans, and this is particularly so with the split within the MDC, and also the factions within ZANU-PF. There are all sorts of issues, including issues around ethnicity. And I'm not talking only about, what people often refer to, which is, Ndebele Shona divisions, but within the Shona-speaking groups, there's also a battle for survival there. And some of the splits in ZANU-PF are more to do with ethnic survival than other things. And there are a range of issues that we all need to talk about. So we need, dialogue that really involves all the stakeholders. And I'm not surprised that perhaps President Mbeki is not speaking about, civil society actors, because in his own country, I think he doesn't regard, civil society as sort of legitimate. In many ways, he's kind of, tried to do away with a lot of the strong civil society participation. And I think some people will say this is wrong, but I think those who talk about the transition to democracy in South Africa. There was a great deal more talking that was done then and a lot more civil society involvement, but many people feel that when the ANC came into power, they started to sort of close that civil society space. And what I think has kept things going is South Africa's strong democratic institutions that allow for these things to happen in spite of what the political players might want. And I think this is what is also important for Zimbabwe, for us to sort of reset the legal framework within which we operate. So a new constitution, a new framework for elections, and something that represents the ideas of all stakeholders.
Yeah, there's a question down here at the front, and then we'll go up to the back there.
My name is Tom Walsh. I'm from Associated Press. I'm just wondering, really, I know you commented earlier on how when Mugabe visits his kind of neighbours, there's a standing ovation for him and a celebratory kind of response. I think there's no doubt, though, that there's a lot of shame and guilt from a lot of African countries, because they know what the Western perception is, and it's just making it worse and worse. I mean, if you saw Kufuor speaking at Chatham House a few weeks ago, he was heckled within there as president of the AU for doing nothing. My real question is, why doesn't the MDC tap into that kind of that feeling of shame and guilt, especially economically, because other Western Eastern countries don't want to trade economically with Africa because they see regimes like Mugabe. Why doesn't the MDC tap into that? And on a second, I suppose, more radical note, has there been any talk of military action?
Well, going to the military action, there has been a half-hearted attempt by a couple of drunken soldiers who shot up Mugabe's house, and they've been arrested, and I believe they might have been executed last Friday. But there's been no serious, coup.
Why do you think it is? Let me ask you this question. Why do you think it is that in West Africa, the military coup has played a very important part in the post-colonial history of the region? There's no tradition of military coups in Southern Africa at all. Why not? Yeah. Even quite good ones.
Well, there was one attempted coup in Lesotho a few years ago, which the South Africans put down very firmly. And in Zimbabwe, Mugabe has been afraid of a military coup from day one. He has always looked after his soldiers. Soldiers have always been taken care of. And so I doubt, it's possible. The soldiers are now beginning to suffer economically. I mean, their salaries can't keep up with inflation. So there's now disgruntlement among the soldiers, but it's the lower ranks. It's not up at the top. But it will get there.
Well, let me go back to the Milosevic analogy, which the MDC, when I was last in Zimbabwe, were very interested in. What happened with Milosevic was that he lost an election. He tried to rig it. When the people came out onto the streets, he said to the army, "I want the tanks on the street." And the head of the army said to him, "It's over. You lost an election, mate. We're not supporting you anymore." Is it conceivable that could happen in Zimbabwe?
So the problem in Zimbabwe is that the army chiefs are ZANU-PF.
The army chiefs in Serbia were Milosevic's political placemen as well. It was a one-party state. The parallels are very exact.
Yeah, I don't see it.
I think, I don't know what the Milosevic army was like, but the Zimbabwean army in many ways mirrors ZANU-PF. So there are divisions also within the army, and I think that also means that you won't necessarily get a sort of general in there saying, well, enough is enough, because there is another counter-general waiting to do the same thing for his own faction. You might get something from lower ranks in the army, and there have been suggestions that something like that could happen and has happened, or at least there have been attempts at it. But, military coups also I think are not an option. The AU, I think one thing that is quite clear from AU precedents recently is that the AU won't accept a military coup. You can do it, but very soon after that you're going to have a democratic election. So I think that the players in Zimbabwe are also aware that that's not very helpful, so they would rather have a democratic face to the whole arrangement. And they're quite happy to have another election because that's the one thing that they can control. They certainly have been able to do that in the past.
Yes, at the back there.
Jeff.
No, who's got the microphone? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I'm Jeff Sango from MDC in Central London.
Can you speak into the microphone very close to your mouth?
Mr. Mbanga, Wilf Mbanga, it's nice to hear that he had a one-to-one with Mugabe at some point. Would you not say Mugabe is a great tactician when it comes to politics, within ZANU-PF itself and without, when you look at the international level? Because if you look at the South African issue about Thabo Mbeki mediating right now, I think we've had a situation where this is been going up to a point where I remember Tony Blair and Thabo Mbeki sometime last year addressing a press conference, and they said, now I think we've got a way forward. Kofi Annan is now going to deal with this issue. So it had climaxed up to that level, right? When Mugabe got into the issue now at the Gambia, when they met Kofi Annan, he outwitted them. And he ended up choosing Mukapa. Right? Nothing happened from there. Now, where are we? We are back to a situation where, again, Mugabe has outwitted the world again. Mugabe is just buying time. He knows that given another one or two delaying tactics, you will be getting senile. And do you remember what happened when Banda left power in Malawi? Do you remember the runs which Mugabe used to do those final days to Malawi? I think Mugabe is a very clever politician. Right now, do you remember, I read some article after this Central Committee meeting they had last week, where the Chinamasa, correct me if I'm wrong, has been tasked with pushing a bill where if during the next term of the president, if he has to step down for whatever reason, an acting president will be chosen. Don't you think Mnangagwa and Mujuru have been persuaded to say, oh look, let's fight this election, push me in front, I'll get the president for you, then afterwards I'll give it to you, but later on Mugabe will turn around and not give it to them.
Okay, yeah, I think we've been through how smart and clever Mugabe is. Let's take a point or a question there, and then the man at the back with his hand up, who's standing up after that.
My name is Wellington Chibangoza. I'm from Free Zim Youth. I just want to say the first thing is we need to clearly define what is the Zimbabwean question, what is the Zimbabwean problem, and the answer to that is an African problem and it needs an African solution. So when we talk about SADC, we're talking about SADC Troika, this meeting that happened last week. One thing we need to realize is the members, the actual people who actually chaired the meeting was Namibia, Angola, and Tanzania, if I'm correct. And Angola and Namibia are great champions of the land reform. And that's where progressive forces in Zimbabwe have been left out, especially by Mugabe, because he's talking left. And African leaders can relate to the left side because that's what like land is the greatest bondage in Africa. And that's one thing that progressive forces in Zimbabwe are not talking about. And that's why when we've got a situation in Africa where all these leaders have to rally behind Mugabe because we've had an opportunity to actually meet and talk to some of the African leaders, some of the African my commission and stuff. And the first thing they say is, what is the alternative to the Zimbabwean question? Who is there? Who can we talk to? And this is in reference to the progressive forces because they realize that neoliberal reforms or reformist politics that is being practiced by the opposition does not apply in the Savannah climate. You see, that's one.
Explain that a bit more clearly. Neoliberal policies as practiced where?
By the progressive forces. In terms that's how the progressive forces are viewed across the region, across Africa, as the British puppets or the Western puppets. Like you can take this instance of Tsvangirai getting beaten up a few weeks back. You see how it was capitalized within the Western media, but it wasn't reported within Africa. We need to start asking ourselves questions why. And then we're talking about solidarity in Africa. How can we get solidarity from the people if we don't talk about issues that Africans can actually relate to?
But it is possible, isn't it, for people to close down whole sections of arguments by saying, neo-imperialist.
Yeah, but that's the thing, though. That's what's actually factual to the Zimbabwean question. Mugabe has been championing it for a long time now. You see, he's been viewed like now he's talking about indigitization, taking mines and everything else. This is someone who's empowering the black masses of Africa, and every African can relate to that. Until we, as progressive forces, realize that, that's the only way we're going to counter Mugabe. We need to shift our political doctrine, and we need to start talking about ideology.
Let me just ask Guguletu Moyo to respond to that. Does that ring a bell with you?
I'm not sure. I don't know, about, every African supporting Mugabe. I know that, if you go to speak to people on the ground, we move around a lot as people working in the non-governmental movement. They are aware of Zimbabwe's situation. They are aware of the suffering that ordinary Zimbabweans are enduring. And they are trying to put pressure on their governments, their leaders, to do something different. I think the leaders are letting people down in that respect. Why they continue to support Mugabe, I don't know. But again, it goes back to, they want to own, the solution. The unfortunate thing, I think, is that they haven't been effective with Mugabe, and I think they haven't found a way.
Let me just ask you, Wolf, I'll come to you in a second. Let me just ask you, because I'm not sure I fully understand what you're arguing. Progressive forces have to do what exactly to...
We have to shift our political ideology. We at the moment we're viewed as we're talking... we're coming from the right. We have to shift our political ideology to actually go in hand with the rest of Africa. Socialism is the way forward in Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, socialism in Africa is the only way forward, because that's, we're talking about a percentage of 95 peasants who are suffering. These are people who are suffering, and the only things they can actually relate to are progressive policies that are going to empower them. So when we talk about POSA and AIPA, these things do not apply to Zambians because they can't relate to that. In a way, they can't actually relate to that. They can sympathize with you, but they can't relate to that.
Okay, Wolf, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about the SADC, the last meeting, which, Mugabe has made a spin, and he's been allowed to get away with murder. He's portrayed himself as the victor from that meeting. He came out of that meeting and said it was a very good meeting, and so on. My information, in fact, is that he had a tough time in that meeting. And there was at one time a brisk exchange of views between him and 3 other leaders. He didn't have it his way. And in fact, for the first time, the SADC leaders seem to be getting closer to the story, to the real story. In the past, they've always said, well, it's a bilateral issue between Zimbabwe and Britain. This time, they've said Mugabe must talk to the opposition in Zimbabwe. Okay, they're still talking of West removing sanctions and so on, but they have for the first time, and this is a shift. That I was talking of, it's an internal problem in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, but at the same time, we need to ask ourselves, Mr. Mbanga, why are they saying it's... You're right. They're still saying it's a bilateral issue between Zimbabwe and the West, because they came out saying that we need to revoke the sanctions to Zimbabwe. And the other thing is, when they talk about, we need to talk about ZANU-PF needs to talk to MDC or the opposition force. It's because of the international pressure that we're getting to a certain level. It was a smoke screen. That's why I'm saying we shouldn't buy into this SADC tracker too much. What we should be talking about is trying to refocus the progressive forces. How can we change our doctrine? Let's do it.
Are you saying, let me just get this right, because I want to move on to another contributor. Are you saying that basically the problem with the progressive forces in places like Zimbabwe is that they're perceived as right-wing and therefore inherently oppressive rather than some kind of liberating force, which is what the left, people like Mugabe, present themselves as? Is that in a nutshell what you're saying?
That's the problem. So that's what I'm saying is, if we're going to counter Mugabe, the easiest thing is, we all know Mugabe talks left, but he walks right.
Okay.
Why not expose him that way?
Thank you very much. But would you like to pass your microphone on to the man in... Oh yeah, the man at the back. I'm losing track of my own order here.
Hi, my name is Philip Chikwiramakoma, and I'm from a charity called We Zimbabwe. I'd just like to address the whole point of tipping points, etc. I'd like to address the whole point of tipping points. So I think there are two things that happened over the past week and a half or so when Tsvangirai was beaten. I think Mugabe overplayed his hand to some extent, and within the Western media context, that image was obviously quite abhorrent, and people got really worked out about that. But I think there's certain elements of fundamental issues to do with the Zimbabwean struggle that actually didn't change that much at that time, in the sense that strategically and as an opposition force, the MDC at that time was still weak, and the whole idea of Tsvangirai being beaten, I think from a Western perspective we viewed it, or from looking at it from London, you viewed it as if that would actually be an inspirational thing. But it could, I saw it as being capable of being an inspirational thing if Tsvangirai to some extent had sort of like taken advantage of that. And I think if you go back into the last 5 years, you might actually be able to identify certain situations where you might argue that Tsvangirai actually did miss some opportunities. And further to that as well, some of the statements, for instance, that Tsvangirai was saying, if I was sitting today in Harare and I hear Tsvangirai being quoted as saying that I cannot protect myself, I'm vulnerable, how can you possibly inspire me to go into the street? And I would just like to then sort of come back to Wilf, the point that you were making in terms of when you were asked what your rating of Tsvangirai is. I just wanted, as a proprietor of a Zimbabwean newspaper, I just wanted to bring you back maybe to just after the split and some of the things that came around as to how that split came around, and also the reports of intra-party violence within the MDC at that time. Are you possibly, is there any danger of then, of you maybe falling in love again with Tsvangirai or starting another one with Tsvangirai?
Very good. But Wilf, you're in the dock now.
No, I've had my fingers bent before. I'm not going to do it again. I think, we as journalists now need to be careful. We made a mistake with Mugabe, and we should make sure that whoever takes over after him, we are going to hold him to account.
Okay, let's, there's a man there. Yep. And then the man there.
Dennis Benton from the Zimbabwe Vigil. Wilf, you neatly sidestepped that. I think one thing that hasn't been brought out in this discussion is the infiltration of the MDC by the CIO. People seem to think that almost impossible things can come out of the MDC when it's so riven by infiltration, which was at the heart of the split-up. Fortunately, they seem to be moving to heal that. More immediately, I'd like to say there's a demonstration outside the embassy tomorrow called by the TUC from 12 to 2 o'clock in solidarity with the Zimbabwe Congress of Trades Unions. At this demonstration, the Zimbabwe Vigil is to launch a new initiative. The chair of the MDC in the UK and Ireland, Ephraim Tapa, who is a member of the Zimbabwe Vigil, is to speak to the South African Broadcasting Corporation about a new petition we are launching, which calls on all the members of the European Union to suspend government-to-government aid to the 14 SADC countries until they agree to observe human rights, a commitment to which they've all subscribed.
Let me ask you a question, since you raised the European Union and nobody's mentioned that before. Given that Britain cannot say really anything because it's damned if it does and damned if it doesn't, what do you think of the record on this question of Britain's European partners?
They've been really rather supportive. Any time that David Treatman has come up with new proposals, with the help of Glenys Kinnock, the European Parliament, they've gone ahead with them. Our latest target is to extend the targeted sanctions. These are the sanctions that SADC asked to be removed. What is the logic there? The only thing they came out with was a statement criticizing the United Kingdom, not criticizing Mugabe. They said withdraw the sanctions. The sanctions are nothing. The sanctions stop Mugabe and his wife going shopping in Paris and Bond Street. And what we're asking now is to extend the targeted sanctions to include the children of these people. For many years, they've been coming and studying in the United Kingdom, the United States, and in Europe. Why? Why should they come here and study when Mugabe has destroyed the educational system in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much. The man in front of you, in the row in front, is there? Yeah. And then the lady down here. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Itai. We run a newspaper, online paper, called talkzimbabwe.com. One of my points has actually been mentioned a second ago about extending the sanctions to include, the children of the leadership in Zimbabwe. But also the sanctions, the targeted sanctions that are there right now, they're ineffective. I think the latest figures have been mentioned is only 200,000 pound equivalent has been frozen in the banks. I mean, 200,000 pounds. Anybody who's banked in Africa knows how insignificant that is. The other thing I wanted to speak about is the mindset of SADC. I'm not sure if people really understand, where Mugabe was coming from. The meeting that was called for by SADC, the extraordinary meeting, was not necessarily to discuss what the media had made people to believe they were going to discuss. And Mr. Mbanga, you've spoken of Mugabe's craftiness. And I'm sure you know the power that Mugabe would have over SADC, the SADC states. So it would be presumptuous for us to think SADC could bring change in Zimbabwe. If you look at the whole of Africa, the African Union, the Charter of the African Union itself was drafted by non-legal people, heads of states. So they are there to protect whatever interests they have. But also we should accept the fact that in Africa there's also some countries that are moving in the right direction, and it would be
which countries are moving in the right direction?
Well, if Zambia at the moment has denounced what's going on in Zimbabwe openly. Mozambique is going in the right direction.
South Africa?
Well, South Africa as well. I think we're expecting too much from South Africa.
Okay. You've made a good point. There's a lady down here who wants to respond to something that was said a little earlier before we bring our panel back in.
Can I get the microphone? I don't have.
If you've got one specific, quite short question, yeah.
Yeah. What I wanted to. Okay.
No. Okay. Lady down here.
Thanks. Italian has already made the point that I was going to make about EU sanctions. To date, as far as I know, the total of EU sanctions is something, or assets frozen, is something in the range of £500,000, which is pathetic. Given the knowledge Mugabe is getting from his anti-sanctions rhetoric, we'd be far better off just to forget it. The other aspect of the sanctions, the targeted sanctions, is that they prevent Mugabe's coterie from travelling around the world. Well, if I were Mugabe, I think that was really quite handy, thanks, because he needs to keep those guys close to him and far away from any other aspects. So
I disagree with the man who spoke earlier, who said the record of the European Union was really rather good.
Absolutely. And I would be interested to know whether people think whether the panel thinks that Britain is really doing more harm than good. And in fact, if they would sort of perhaps look towards SADC to make the moves that everybody's expecting, and perhaps ask Thabo and Becky to put on the table what he thinks would be good conditions under which Britain could finally pay their last tranche of the land compensation, we might get a lot further.
Okay, I'm going to take two more points, one from the man at the back and then one from the man with his hand up there, and then I'll ask the panel to sum up because we're getting close to our deadline.
I just wanted to touch on a couple of points. Firstly, I disagree with the gentleman from Zimbabwe Youth. I appreciate what he's saying. There needs to be a critique from the left. But there are progressive forces in Zimbabwe. They may not necessarily be the MDC, but the women and the youth and so forth, they are progressive, even in an ideological sense. My key point is actually to pick up on, and I'd like comment back from the panel, but looking at a strategy which might be regarded as an international strategy on Zimbabwe. We had the regional issue, then there's this international issue. What we picked up on here is this question about EU sanctions, the targeted sanctions. Now clearly, and I think this was understood by the British government at least 3 years ago, that for the British government or even the EU to do something is playing straight into Mugabe's hands. I've just come back from Zimbabwe, and the reaction in Zimbabwe, by ZANU-PF exploited it, and SADC in South Africa to the UN sanctions is reflected in SADC's call for the West to drop sanctions, not even knowing what it is. I think we have to look carefully, because I respect what the Vigil is doing, and I respect petitions. But maybe we need to look at ways in which the British government and the EU and others can use other instruments to actually try and pressurize change in Zimbabwe.
And very briefly,
the UN peacekeeping forces. Okay, Zimbabwe Republic peace officers are on record. We've got all the reports of absolute brutality and torture. ZCTU, what happened on March the 11th.
The UN requires the permission of the host government to send in peacekeeping forces, I mean.
No, what I'm saying is to have Zimbabwe police on UN peacekeeping missions like in Kosovo. We have on record too that certain policemen who have been on those missions are torturers. That's the first thing that could be done. No more Zimbabwe Republic police on UN peacekeeping missions. One, because they're regarded as a perk. They get foreign currency. Secondly, Interpol. Relationships or Zimbabwe's position with regard to Interpol. The vice chairman of Interpol recently was the police commissioner in Zimbabwe. Thirdly, I touched on what Gugu said earlier about the Human Rights Council. South Africa in the Security Council recently voted with China and Russia not to have any resolution on Zimbabwe because it didn't fall within Chapter 7, i.e. it wasn't a threat to international peace and security. South Africa said it's a Human Rights Council issue. So we should say, fine, South Africa, raise it then in the Human Rights Council, or at least do not oppose it. And finally, can I say this finally? Okay. Everyone's forgotten about the Commonwealth. Everyone's forgotten about the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, in terms of the Mobile Action Plan for the Commonwealth, is obliged and called upon, even if a country withdraws from the Commonwealth through bilateral and multilateral means, to put pressure on that country to change. Now that's another thing which Britain and others can do or use behind the scenes. But for Britain and the EU to continue to have this the sort of megaphone diplomacy, or to be seen to be, it plays right into the regime's hands. But there are other ways that one can try and exert pressure from the outside.
Okay, and you just given us four of them. The man, one final point here. The man down, and we'll ask the panel to sum up.
I'm just going to touch a little bit on the sanctions, the European sanctions. I think, why do we keep on empowering Mugabe if you're talking about sanctions? Because we know that's what's giving him political mileage on the continent. One thing we need to start focusing on is there's a campaign we launched called Africa Liberate Zimbabwe campaign, where we're directly attacking and confronting and actually sitting down with some of the African leaders and some of the African influences and actually trying to gain solidarity through the way, and also talking to other African communities. It's a shame there's not a lot of African communities in this meeting like tonight. We should start interacting and talking with other African, seeking solidarity from other African nationals. That's the one way we're going to move forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to ask the panel to sum up. Wilf, a lot of talk in the last 5 minutes or so about the European Union sanctions. It is a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because it can be perceived in Zimbabwe as something essentially neo-colonial.
Right. And also every time Tony Blair, talks about Zimbabwe, it plays straight into Mugabe's hands. They keep saying that, Britain wants to recolonize us and so on. And in any case, those sanctions are breached every time. The Belgians last month allowed a Zimbabwean minister to travel to Belgium for an EU ACP meeting. The French have invited Mugabe to attend an Afro summit. The Portuguese, I understand, want Mugabe to attend a European Union ACP meeting later this year. So Europe is not serious about even those sanctions. They have not worked, and all this done is to empower Mugabe in Africa. If they mean to have sanctions, let's have meaningful sanctions that hurt. As Zimbabwe flies into London, Zimbabwe House is full of Zimbabwean spies and so on. There are certain things that could be done.
Are there any Zimbabwean spies here, by the way?
Oh, I'm sure of that.
Gugulethu.
One thing that we didn't talk about, missed opportunities. I think that Morgan Tsvangirai has missed opportunities, but we won't go into that. But one thing I think that we overlook is the situation of ordinary Zimbabweans right now. There's the high prevalence of HIV, AIDS, people are dying, and it doesn't help that the healthcare system has collapsed. I don't know, they also, a lot of people don't have access to food at the moment. There's a serious food security problem in Zimbabwe, and the government has just said that they don't want any food aid, in spite of the fact that it's predicted that many people will starve in the coming months.
Access to food has become a political weapon, hasn't it?
It has. So, whether it's realistic to expect those people to get up and go out on the street and do something about Mugabe, I don't know, particularly because 80% of those people who live in Zimbabwe live in the rural areas. So where they would go to and where they would be getting information from about how to organize, I don't know. So it is a bit different from the situation in South Africa some years ago. And I think the difference also with South Africa was the diaspora was very active, and the Zimbabwean diaspora is not that active. There are very few people who are involved in trying to actually affect change in Zimbabwe from outside. The usual suspects are involved, but there are 3 or 4 million Zimbabweans who are outside of Zimbabwe, and I don't know what they're doing about the situation, but I think that they could do more.
Well, they're trying to survive.
They are, but I think that they should do more than that. Just trying to sustain the people that they can take care of in Zimbabwe, it just doesn't work.
Daniel, last word before we wrap up.
Sorry.
Do you want to? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
The last point, the sanctions. I don't think that the sanctions work if it's just Europe. If you don't deal with China, Malaysia, and so on, it just doesn't work. But there is an important moral point, and I think that many Zimbabweans appreciate that. Also,
should the sanctions regime also try to embrace SADC? I mean, shouldn't the European Union be saying to the SADC countries, you impose these sanctions too. You deny the right of Mugabe and his entourage to go to Sun City, by the way, and rent a whole floor of the hotel.
Absolutely. And this is another point where perhaps dropping the sanctions might be useful, because there are legal mechanisms that can be used to deal with certain elements in the Mugabe government right now. Torture, for instance, is prohibited in international law in absolute terms, and those countries that have the legislation to prosecute, and that includes the United Kingdom, could prosecute people who have been implicated. In fact, they have an obligation to do so if they come within their jurisdiction. So it might be helpful, in fact, if some of those people turned up here. So there is another side to this. Similarly, countries like South Africa doesn't have, I think, the appropriate legislation, but there are things that they can do with legal mechanisms. So sanctions might not be that helpful.
Daniel?
There's been a lot of interesting discussion here about the detail of sanctions, about the way in which the international community should look at this problem and ways in which it could attempt to navigate towards some kind of solution. Ultimately, though, the reason why there is no Serbia moment happening in Zimbabwe at the moment is because there is no mass action. Now, that's the great mystery. Why is there no mass action? How can that mass action be organized? We've talked a lot about the problems that are involved in that. And it's a very difficult thing for anybody to take on. They are likely to have to pay the ultimate price of that, but it will take leadership, and at the point that there is that kind of leadership, there is a possibility for mass action. That mass action might reveal that the military is not prepared to fire on the civilian population, but until there is a mass movement of that kind, we're not going to know.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I've gone over our time by about 10 minutes. I'm going to draw it to a close there. I just want to say one thing before we finish. If you are not a member of the Frontline Club, you like it here, you might want to think about joining, please come and speak to somebody downstairs. It's a great club to be a member of. Thank you very much for this fantastically serious and informed discussion. I hope you got as much from it as I did. Please thank Gugula Tamoyo, Wilf Mbanga, and Daniel Howden.